It'll be a field day for, the Violence Policy Center, the Brady people.
What do you think the odds of that happening if you had to place a bet?
Gosh, I'd rather place a bet, at the crap table in Atlantic City. Here's the breakdown in this court. You have 4 justices, Breyer, Ginsburg, Souter, and Stevens, that as far as I can see are going to be in favor of the D.C. regulation. You have 4 on the other side, Alito, Roberts, Scalia, and Thomas. I'd be willing to bet a small amount that the 4 of them will be more favorable to what we would consider to be the correct interpretation, whichever particular construction they use. They'll be in favor of Heller in some way. The swing vote then becomes Justice Anthony Kennedy. And Kennedy really, to a large extent, to my mind at least, is a very loose cannon. It's hard to tell which way he's going to go, but he tends to side with the, shall we say, liberal wing of the court, more so than he does with the conservative wing. And this is a fellow who, in more than one case, has said quite clearly that he believes that foreign law can be used to interpret the Constitution. So heaven knows he may look at some UN protocol on gun control and say that should be used to interpret the Second Amendment. So you have a 4-4 split, and here's this fellow in the middle. Which way is he going to go? And my unfortunate gut feeling is that he is more likely to go towards the liberal side, that is in some way towards upholding the statute, favoring D.C., than he is to go in the other direction. And you have to get 5, or the other side has to get 5. And we have essentially a 4-4 split, and here's Kennedy in the middle. And the really murky problem occurs if you don't get a clear majority for a particular opinion. See, they could rule affirmed or denied, period. They could say we're going to uphold the statute or we're going to strike this D.C. ordinance down. And then they could write a whole bunch of different opinions, some concurring, some dissenting, back and forth, so that you really don't have a single interpretation of why they're doing what they do. I've seen some cases along those lines. But then what happens, that plate full of opinions goes down to the lower courts, and it gets reinterpreted by the lower courts. And quite often that turns into a real mishmash, especially with this issue, because I think the lower courts, federal courts at least, and probably most of the state courts, certainly in states like New York, California, Illinois, what have you, states where gun control is still politically favored, those lower courts are, let's say, 85% or higher anti-Second Amendment. They want to disarm the average American. So you could have a win. This, in a way, this might be the worst of all possibilities. You could have a win for Heller in the sense that they say the statute's unconstitutional. They come up with 3 or 4 different opinions as to why it is or why it isn't, because there'll be some dissenters as well as some people in favor of that judgment. Heller wins his case, and then lawyers argue about what this decision means for the next 10 years in the lower courts, and those lower courts will interpret it whatever way they want to. That's the unfortunate thing. It will be very unlikely that if that case were to be misinterpreted in California, for instance, in favor of some gun control law, that the Supreme Court would immediately take another appeal or a certiorari to correct that mistake. They generally don't do that. I've seen that certainly in the area of labor law. In fact, I had one case. It had been 48 years since the statute was passed, 48 years before it finally got to them, and they gave a correct interpretation of the statute. And you can imagine how many lower court cases, or in that instance there was the National Labor Relations Board Administrative Agency, how many dozens of cases there had been incorrectly interpreting that statute over that 48 years.
I'm curious, if you don't mind, what do you make of the Solicitor General on behalf of the Bush administration?
Right.
He gets 15 minutes to talk before the court, as I understand.
Right.
And he's taken a position that is a little peculiar. I'm just wondering if you're able to elaborate on that.
Well, he's trying to salvage out of this the vast majority of federal gun control legislation, plus the widest ambit for future legislation. I think in his particular brief, it really does boil down to the reasonable regulation theory. He doesn't want even the compelling state interest theory, let alone what I call the militia theory, the absolute right interpretation. And the reason for that is a great deal of the gun control legislation, as you know, Aaron, came out of or under color of, as the lawyers say, the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause tends to be interpreted by the Supreme Court on a reasonable regulation basis. So the Solicitor General doesn't want the court to come up with some more limiting interpretation, because that might open up the possibility of attacks on some of these Commerce Clause statutes that are already out there, or it might throw some cold water on future legislation, because the proponents would be putting this forward, and the opponents would say, wait a minute, this legislation doesn't meet the compelling interest test, so we have to either not pass it or rewrite it or something or other. So he's obviously taking what I would call a kind of practitioner's point of view here. He's trying to salvage as much as he can for his client, being the government of the United States, and everything that the government of the United States has on the table in terms of this vast mass of gun control legislation that's already there. Now, I think from the point of view of what shall I say, a technical lawyer, yeah, well, that's fine. That's essentially what technical lawyers do. But from the point of view of the politics of the situation, that's certainly not the impression that the Bush administration left people with several years ago when he was running for office in terms of his position on Second Amendment rights.
Does the Supreme Court care what the American people think concerning this issue?
No, I don't think so at all. In this particular instance, the thing that really worries me, of course, is that the Supreme Court may feel, that they don't want to take the chance of coming up with some broad interpretation that strikes down perhaps not just the D.C. law, but some other laws. And then you end up with what they imagine would happen, with more guns in the hands of more people, an increase in urban violence. Because I think they probably do believe the theory that guns in some sense cause crime. These aren't people that have studied John Lott, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
All right. So they tend to be motivated in many instances by those kind of mythical interpretations, sociological interpretations. You see a lot of really jejune stuff in these opinions. And I would doubt that there are very many of them there that really understand the relationship between guns and crime. Now, there may be one. I mean, someone like Thomas might very well. I don't know too much about Alito or Roberts. Scalia might. That's four. You might get some realistic assessment. I think you'll get the exact opposite out of the other four. And then, of course, it comes down, as I said before, to Kennedy. And he may tell you that the UN Convention on Disarmament, is the thing that we ought to be following.
Well, Edwin, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today. We've been talking about the Heller case. We will have this program in a transcript form also. By the way, do you have some contact information?
Actually, if they simply go to newswithviews.com and go to the contributor column, they can get into my archive. And then at the end of any one of my commentaries there, many of which are on this subject, militia interpretation of the Constitution, they will find address there which they can contact me.
I want to thank you, Edwin. This has been Talking to America. I am your host, Aaron Zellman. And I want to remind you, if you won't defend your rights, don't complain when you lose them.
Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of JPFO.org or its members. Talkin' to America is a production of JPFO.org.